For a long time, my life unfolded as a sequence of almosts. I almost got the job, almost surrendered in that relationship, almost allowed myself to feel joy. It was as if I were playing the role of someone about to succeed, but backstage, I kept dismantling the set before the final applause. Sabotage never arrived as a conscious decision. It whispered its way in, altered the script, changed a line. A message I didn't send, a commitment I conveniently forgot, a delay I disguised as timing. It was a perfectly rehearsed ruin, a theater of collapse performed in silence. The cruelest part was that sabotage wore the mask of logic. It's not the right time. I need to be more prepared. I'm protecting my peace. And so the years passed while I memorized increasingly sophisticated excuses, even for myself. I was the protagonist of an invisible narrative written by hands I didn't recognize but followed with unwavering devotion. Over time, I realized my fear wasn't failure. It was worthiness. There was a place inside me where success felt dangerous, as if something terrible would happen if I were truly seen, celebrated, or fulfilled. Victory exposed me. Happiness betrayed something sacred. It was safer to remain in the almost, in the shadow of potential, where no one could see too much. Self-sabotage isn't stupidity. It's loyalty to an old vow, a vow stitched together with silence and averted eyes. I learned early that being too bright was a threat, that joy was offensive in wounded homes. So I molded myself into what was tolerable. Small victories restrained delight. I made fear my belonging strategy. Even my body learned to speak the language of abandonment. It would seize up when life began to flow. Pain, fatigue, anxiety. It was as if my entire system screamed, "It's not safe to be happy." So I began leaving before the peak, walking away from intimacy, pulling the plug on dreams right at the edge of achievement, not out of inability, but out of unconscious loyalty to a pain I didn't want to betray. Sabotage didn't arrive violently. It came as exhaustion, as maturity, as logic. But beneath it, a quiet devotion lived, to a belief that I was never meant to thrive. Sabotaging myself made the pain predictable. And pain, however cruel, was familiar. This fear of shining didn't appear from nowhere. It was inherited. My parents, my grandparents, all of them learned to dim their light to avoid wounding others, to avoid being exiled. And I continued their script, believing that hiding was an act of love. Sabotage became legacy, and legacy became identity. Even now, when everything seems fine, I still hear a whisper, "It won't last." And sometimes, I'm the one who makes sure it doesn't. If you're tired of living in the almost, comment, "It's finally safe for me to deserve," somewhere in childhood without being told directly. I learned how dangerous it was to be too visible. Not through words, but through silences. Through the way affection would tighten when I smiled too brightly. Through the way adults changed the subject when I was proud. The air would shift, the room would shrink. I understood it, not consciously but viscerally, that joy could be a threat. That being whole could cost me connection. And so I made a pact. Not one I remember making, but one I've obeyed all my life. The pact was simple. Don't be too happy, too loud, too radiant. Don't shine too long or too hard. Because in that house, joy wasn't celebrated, it was scrutinized. Happiness, if too visible, could awaken discomfort, resentment, even abandonment. And the child I was learned how to survive by dimming, by becoming acceptable, manageable, soft around the edges. I shaped myself into what wouldn't provoke. Victories had to be small. Excitement had to be brief. I could be bright, but never for too long. I could succeed, but only if I apologized for it. My nervous system was conditioned to associate visibility with danger, not imagined but remembered. This wasn't about low self-esteem. It was about survival. I wasn't just afraid of being seen. I was afraid that being seen meant I'd lose love. Or worse, that I'd be too much for the ones I needed most. And so I internalized a rhythm. Try, almost arrive, then retreat. Long before anything could be taken from me, I would take it from myself. That way, the heartbreak was mine. And strangely, heartbreak felt safer than hope. Even now, when something beautiful begins to unfold, I feel my body tense, my chest tightens, my joy gets caught in my throat. And without knowing why, I pull away. I disappear. Not because I don't want it, but because some part of me still believes that love requires sacrifice. That in order to be safe, I have to be small. If your joy still triggers guilt, comment. I made a pact I'm finally ready to break. My body always knew what my mind refused to acknowledge. It learned the story long before I did. Not in language, but in reaction. Every time something good began to form, connection, momentum, joy, my body flinched. It didn't celebrate. It prepared for collapse. And so did I. I called it stress. I called it overthinking. I called it being realistic. But it was none of that. It was memory. Not of a specific moment, but of an entire emotional lineage. My body remembered the cost of expansion, the loneliness that followed visibility, the punishments for standing out. And so it developed a script of resistance. Sacred, precise, unspoken. The better life became, the more something inside me tightened. A surge of fatigue before good news, a headache before the breakthrough. My nervous system sounded alarms at the scent of success, not because it didn't want happiness, but because happiness had always been paired with danger. I had trained my body to expect loss after light, so I preemptively returned to suffering, not out of masochism, but to regain control. If I ended things myself, the world couldn't take them from me. If I walked away first, no one could abandon me. It was a sacred repetition. Rehearse deprivation, perform withdrawal, keep everything manageable. This wasn't self-sabotage. It was self-preservation disguised as withdrawal. The body doesn't lie, but it also doesn't forget. It protects based on memory, not reality. And so I lived with one foot on the brake, terrified of acceleration. Because acceleration meant vulnerability, movement meant exposure, and exposure had once meant pain. So I stayed slow, quiet, almost, because almost was safe. If your body still mistakes peace for danger, comment. I'm learning to feel safe in my own joy. Sabotage never arrived as a dramatic act. It was almost elegant. It dressed itself in restraint, insensibility, in false maturity. It spoke in the language of, I'm just being cautious. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's not get too excited. And because its voice resembled reason, I listened, every time. But beneath that calm exterior lived a ritual, a deeply private devotion to staying small. Every time something promising emerged, a new connection, an open door, a wave of inspiration, something in me quietly constructed its undoing. I created distance where closeness was blooming. I introduced conflict where harmony lived. I forgot things. I pulled back. I disappeared. I wasn't protecting myself from failure. I was protecting a much older truth. That too much joy was unsustainable. That fulfillment was a provocation. That people leave when you shine too brightly. So I dimmed, not because I lacked desire, but because I feared disruption. And deep inside, I began to associate the act of withholding with love, as if saying no to myself was a way of saying yes to others. As if ruining what was beautiful made me safer to those who never knew how to hold beauty. I rehearsed ruin as if it were a form of loyalty, a way to stay tethered to the people I came from, the ones who had to suppress their own light to belong. And without realizing it, I made sabotage sacred. I turned it into a gesture of love, a signal to the past that I hadn't betrayed it. But love that requires destruction is not love. It's fear in disguise. And no amount of logic will protect you from the ache of abandoning yourself repeatedly in the name of emotional safety. If you've mistaken sabotage for love, comment, I'm ready to stop breaking what I deserve. Somewhere in my bloodline, someone learned that to shine was to be punished. That joy was arrogant, that pride was dangerous, and that belief, unspoken but deeply embedded, traveled through generations until it reached me, dressed not as fear, but as humility. I didn't question it, I carried it like legacy. When things began to work out, I would shrink. When someone celebrated me, I'd change the subject. When I felt seen, I'd retreat. It wasn't shame, it was loyalty. I believed that keeping my joy small was an act of love, that if I stayed modest, invisible, digestible, I could stay connected. I could stay safe. But this isn't safety. It's inheritance. A script I didn't write but performed with precision. My parents were careful with their light. My grandparents even more so. They came from places where joy drew suspicion, where success invited envy, where the bright were dimmed before they threatened the room. And so I learned that being neutral, being muted, being almost was the only way to belong. So when opportunities came, I hesitated. When love deepened, I pulled away. When I felt peace, I prepared for loss. Not because I wanted to suffer, but because I thought it was the price of being loved. This is how I kept the lineage alive, by dimming in their name. But every time I disappear from myself, I reinforce the lie that my radiance is a risk. That being whole is a betrayal, and the cost is devastating, because each withdrawal is a quiet death of the self I've never fully allowed to live. If you've learned to dim as a form of survival, comment, "I'm ready to unlearn the silence I inherited." It was protection. A pact with those who taught me survival meant staying small, quiet, unseen. I didn't fear success. I feared what it might cost. Disconnection, exile, grief. To heal felt like betrayal. So I stayed close to pain, mistaking it for loyalty. I said no to what I deeply wanted, not out of fear, but out of love. Twisted love, inherited love. The kind that says, "Don't grow too much. Don't leave us behind." Sabotage became devotion, a quiet ritual of staying familiar, even if it meant staying wounded. The saboteur wasn't a villain. He was a guardian of the past. He kept me close to what felt safe. The pain I knew, the patterns I understood. But safety is not the same as freedom, and comfort isn't the same as truth. I began to see the cost. The joy I feared, the expansion I sabotaged. Every step toward wholeness felt like betrayal, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. Light wasn't the danger, it was what the light would reveal, the self I buried to survive. So I ran. Back to smallness, back to the self who knew how to shrink, perform, belong. Because becoming new meant grieving the old me, the one who was only loved when he was hurting. And grief, even when it's necessary, feels like death. Until one day I was too tired to pretend. The mask didn't fall, it dissolved. The stories stopped working. The excuses went silent. And in that silence, something else emerged. A whisper. Not a demand, not a warning. Just, "There is more." That voice felt like loss, because I saw how long I had been rehearsing my disappearance, how deeply I believed that joy was unsafe and peace unearned. Healing didn't arrive as clarity. It came as collapse, a slow surrender. Living fully isn't a breakthrough. It's a quiet vow. I'm not leaving myself anymore.